So wormhole is a theoretical structure of space-time envisioned as a tunnel connecting 2 points that are separated by space and time. This is theoretical, but this is kind of envisioned like this, where we've got space-time being folded, and the wormhole is connected by 2 points, typically what we consider a black hole, which we now actually have images of, which is super exciting. Right? Yeah, let's give it up for the scientists. The problem with wormholes, however, is they can have some unexpected side effects that we're not a fan of. OK, but the Control Value Accessor, fortunately, does not have any side effects that I'm aware of. It has not produced a Demogorgon as far as I have been using it, so I think we're safe. OK, but the Control Value Accessor actually defines an interface that acts as a bridge between Angular Forms API and a native element in the DOM. Blah, 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 blah. What does that mean? We can do a couple really, really powerful things with this to solve form problems. Most specifically, we can implement an interface to create a custom form control that integrates really nicely with Angular Forms. So if we envision our wormhole like this, we've got our Control Value Accessor, which is passing information in between a custom directive or a control that we have created and the parent form that it is a part of. And if you're not familiar with forms as much and some of these terms, we'll go through that. So how do we actually begin to use the Control Value Accessor to make some really awesome, powerful things happen? To demonstrate this, we are going to build a sample application. And so I will, sorry, they kind of did something weird with my setup. Where is my, sorry about this. We'll just use the GIF for now. But what we're going to be doing is creating a sample application. And we're going to have a couple different custom components that we have. First of all, we've got a Typeahead that we're going to be able to select a galaxy from. And then we're going to have some sort of star rating system where we can rate how awesome we think this galaxy is. And then we will save our name to let people know what we think about this galaxy. So to really kind of illustrate what we're going to be doing here, we're going to have these custom components that act as form elements in our reactive form. We're going to have, again, our Typeahead component. And what we're going to be doing is displaying one value to the user. But what we really care about is the ID for whatever that galaxy is. And that's what we want to be passing as our form value. And then for our star rating component, very similarly, we're going to have something displaying in the UI. But all we really care about is, again, submitting some sort of rating number to our form as its value. So Reactive Forms crash course. Is everybody on the Reactive Forms train in here? It's OK. I'll get the rest of you on board. A reactive form is a model-driven approach to handling form inputs whose values change over time. So this can be a much cleaner way to implement forms that can get really messy when we start to nest and create dynamic components inside. The form control is our basic building block. So you can think of this as a basic input element that you would have. You have some sort of form control representation for that. And this is going to track the value of whatever that form is and the validation status as well. A form group is a group of form controls. So if you have some sort of object structure that you need to submit your values in, we can use a form group made of form controls that will handle that for us. And then the form control name is a directive that I tend to use that is going to tie a form element to a form control. There's also just the form control directive, and I'll show both of those in this. So when we look at creating our reactive form for our sample application, this is what that's going to look like. We're going to have a main form group, and then we just have 3 different form controls: our galaxy form control, our rating form control, and our name form control. A couple things we care about is we want our rating form control to be disabled by default. And so that's kind of a common situation you might run into with forms when they're dependent on different values and figuring out how to have that happen. So in our form, we don't want our ratings to be enabled until our Typeahead dropdown actually has a value in it. So when we begin to build out our form, this is what that markup is going to look like. We will be tying our galaxy form via the form group control. And then I've got a couple custom components in here that I have already created. So you can see that GR Typeahead, GR standing for galaxy rating, as well as my GR star rater. And then I'm going ahead and I'm passing in an array of galaxies for our data that we're going to put in that Typeahead to populate. And you might be thinking, OK, well, Jennifer, I can solve this problem already. This is not that big of a deal. I'm going to wire up my custom component. When a user interacts with it, I'm going to emit a change event. It'll be awesome. In my parent component, I'll go ahead and I'll use like my change listener. I'll push that value to the form using set value or patch value, and I'll be fine. Like, I don't need your control value accessor. Oh, but you do. OK, so there are a couple pitfalls with this solution. When we manage all these methods for listening to event changes, this is a pretty common pattern in Angular, but it's not one we need to be implementing for building custom form controls. Having to have that additional method of patch value on our form control every time we're getting a change from somewhere else can be really messy to deal with. And how would we even begin to figure out how to deal with validation for this? OK, so let's take a look at applying the Control Value Accessor to this. And first, we need to understand that the Control Value Accessor is an interface, and it's got a couple methods on it that are required. With TypeScript, we know that interfaces have to have all their methods or properties implemented as long as they were required. So if you're beginning to implement the Control Value Accessor interface, you are going to get errors with your TypeScript compiler until you have all the methods implemented appropriately. So walking through these methods, let's see what's going on. First of all, we have the WriteValue, and this is going to write the value to the element. And so this is really important for understanding where our value is coming from. This is going to be called in 2 different instances. This is going to be called at first when the form is instantiated, and then again if patch value or set value is called to update this form control. So if we look at this in kind of our wormhole diagram that we're referring back to, we've got our component that is implementing the Control Value Accessor interface. And it might be displaying whatever the value is. Like, let's say we're doing a name input, and my name is Jennifer. That's what's in the value. That's what we want to display in our UI. So the way the component implementing the Control Value Accessor interface is going to get that is when we are either calling our new form control and passing in a value of Jennifer, or if we are using patch value or set value to actually modify the content of that form control. So it's important to understand how you're actually getting these values through. The next method we need to care about is register on change. And so this is something that we need to control to let our parent form know that our form control value has changed. So if we've already implemented and the user makes some sort of selection, they change the name from, let's say, Jennifer to Elisa, we want to be able to communicate that to our parent form. And so that's going to look like this, where we've got our component. We've fired this onChange event with some sort of new value. The Control Value Accessor, our wormhole, is getting that value. And then, for instance, if we are subscribing to value changes on that form control name, we are going to get that new value of Elisa. So that's how we're starting to pass the information back and forth. All right, register untouched is our next one, and this is very similar to onChange. We want to let a form control know when it has been interacted with. A lot of times we'll use this for validation. So if a user is interacting with a form and there's a required field and they touch it but don't fill in any information, we might want a way to show the user that, hey, they do need to require, or they do need to fill out this form. So that is what we're going to call on a blur function. And so when you're implementing this custom component and your user interacts with your element and has some sort of blur where they don't necessarily update information, but they've touched or interacted with it, that's when we want to call our onTouched method, which is going to send that touched. This is going to set our form control touched value to true, as well as add the class ng-touched. So if you're not familiar with Angular validation and the way it adds all its different classes, we can easily hook into those by making sure that the validation status and the touch status and the dirty status are updated properly. And finally, we have set disabled state. And you'll notice that this is an optional function, so you do not need to implement it. But this is going to be called to track the disabled state of a form. So this will be called either when a form control is instantiated with a disabled or a disabled key that is true or false, or when you actually call .enable or .disable on the form element. So back to our diagram here, we've got our component. We're doing something with our set disabled state. Maybe we're making changes to our UI that we're displaying to let the user know that this component is disabled. So we need to be able to get that information when the form is actually disabled. OK, let's look at actually what implementation for the Control Value Accessor looks like so you all can begin to use this. So we're going to have to use the ng-value accessor to register this component as a provider for the Control Value Accessor. And this is going to register the component early, so we need to use forward ref to refer to it. So this is what your basic structure is going to look like. You'll notice I do not have Control Value Accessor implemented yet or any of the methods. This is just some of our setup code. And then when we do have it implemented, you can see I've got my methods that we talked about here, writing value, where I'm setting the value that I'm receiving from the form control. On this component, I've got my onChange method aliased. I've got my register onTouched method aliased, as well as my setDisabledState. I'm setting a disabled member on my component to be whatever the disabled state is. If you look at the template, I've got my input, and we've got some sort of change event. And when a user interacts with that, I'm going to go ahead and call onTouched and onChange. And with onChange, I'm going to pass along whatever the current value of that form control is. And don't worry, all this sample code is available online for those of you not at the fancy tables with laptops out. OK, when we look at actually tying this component into our form markup, this is what you saw earlier, where I do have my component in there. And this is what's really awesome. We're not inputting or having any event listeners or anything like that. We just are binding the same way we would bind a basic form control using form control name. This is the exact same as using form control, and then in the case of a group, iterating through the forms controls, and then using the key of whichever one you're looking for. So that's all this takes to hook it up in your form. It's pretty clean, right? Anytime I can remove lines of code and have something this readable, I am all on board. So let's revisit our original problem of using this in practice to go ahead and create our Typeahead and our rating form controls. So our Typeahead is going to look like this, where we are using maybe some sort of third-party library, making sure we're displaying a name to the user, but then what we really care about is submitting the ID of whatever that thing is. So this is what that data structure would look like, and I'm sure you've seen this problem before, where you want to display something to the user that's readable, that makes sense to them, but all you really care about is submitting something else. OK, we will look at this markup because it's a little bit easier to see over here. But I'm just using a third-party library here, basic Typeahead. We've been implementing these for God knows how many years now. So there are a couple things going on. In here, I've got my data that I am passing in that is going to set the different drop-down options. I am also using this template structure because, again, remember our data structure looks like this, and we don't want to display all that. All we care about is displaying the name. So that's what I'm doing here. And then here's where I'm actually starting to tie my events into my form control. So when the Typeahead select function is registered, I want to call my custom onSelect function. And the same with blur. If somebody interacts with our form control, we want to go ahead and emit that blur function. And so in my component that is then implementing the Control Value Accessor, we have these functions, and I'm doing a couple different things here that are important to know. Remember we talked about WriteValue being called with the value anytime that the form is either initialized or setValue or patchValue are done. Well, for our UI to work properly, if this change happens, we want to make sure that we're going through and actually manually selecting that dropdown. So if there is a value, I've got a custom function here that is going to select the appropriate dropdown so we can make sure that our UI is corresponding properly to whatever's happening in that form control. And then with the events that we tied over here, I have my onSelect event, and when we're selecting something, we do want to fire an onTouched event because, yes, the user has touched and interacted with this form. And then if our actual form item that has been selected is changed, we want to go ahead and fire our onChange method with whatever the ID of that item is. And then with onBlur, we do want to submit an onTouched function. And then in this, I want to make sure that I'm handling a situation where if a user completely deletes whatever is in the select event isn't going to fire. And so I want to make sure that I am updating that to be a null value because they have eliminated whatever was in that form. So that's what an implementation of using the Control Value Accessor looks like for this case of a Typeahead. Of course, you can begin to abstract this out and make it really easy to use in a variety of different scenarios and situations. Let's look next at our rating component. And so this one is a little bit different because we're doing all this really interesting kind of displaying to the UI that doesn't really match up with a custom form control. So what does it take to make this happen? We can look at our star rating component. And we're going to see a lot of the same methods. We're going to have WriteValue where we're setting our initial value, and that is going to set how many stars we're displaying initially. So again, if you are calling setValue or patchValue to change the update or change the value of this form control, that is going to update accordingly. This one, remember that we said we want to disable it unless the Typeahead has a value. So this is where we're implementing that set disabled state method. And then whatever that returns, I'm going to go ahead and set my rating component to have the disabled member to be true or false. So inside my HTML for this, we'll kind of look at what that looks like. Because this is a very custom implementation, it's not like an actual form control that I can just call disable on. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a class that lets me know and lets the user know that it's disabled. We'll kind of gray out the stars. They won't be interactive, excuse me. And then when we go back to our component file here, we can actually show how we are setting our rating. And so we want to make sure that if the form control is not disabled because we don't want the user interacting with it, that we can go ahead and we'll update the values. I've got some special UI going on here for the rating text, and then I'm emitting the unchanged with the star rating that I care about, and then also emitting the untouched value. All right. So if we want to then go ahead and test our custom components implementing the CVA interface, what kind of things do we care about? Well, one, the fact that wormholes aren't unit testables, but Control Value Accessor components are. So woohoo, we're excited about that. But we want to test that our methods communicate with the form control as expected. And so we want to make sure that when we're setting values or patching values or updating different states, that that's going to behave as expected. We want to make sure that when our form control is being initialized, that the UI is reflecting whatever that value it's initialized with appropriately. We want to make sure that disabling or enabling of the CVA component is implemented correctly so we can make sure our user understands what's going on. And then we want to make sure that those validation classes that I mentioned are being implemented appropriately so that way we can begin to display really helpful information to the user. So if we want to look at a test setup, one of the ways that I prefer to test components using this are to create some sort of test host component where I'm going ahead and implementing my Control Value Accessor component in this kind of way. I can make sure that the parent component, which is going to contain the form control, is going to get the information necessary updated, but then I can also test what's happening inside of that test host component, which is my Control Value Accessor component. So if we're testing some sort of change event, we want to go ahead and call our method that's going to be handling that change event. And then we want to listen to our parent host component and make sure that that form control value is the value that we're expecting it to be. So that's kind of a sample test of what that would look like. We also really care about testing touch events and validation, so we want to make sure that our form control is getting the information necessary. So a couple different things going on here. I am setting this form control to be required to handle that, and then making sure that the proper classes like ng-invalid are being set when there's a blur event fired on that input and there is no value set. So we want to make sure that that is actually showing, hey, yes, this is now an invalid form control. We also want to be able to test set value. So if somebody is calling .setValue or .patchValue on our form control, that our UI is going to reflect that appropriately. If we're looking at our star rating component, one of the things we're going to care about in this one is that our form control is being notified of the change when the star is clicked. So again, when we fire a click event on one of our stars, we want to make sure that the form control in the our test host component has the appropriate value that we want it to have. And then for the star rating component, we do care about the disabled state again. So we want to test and make sure that when we disable the component and then attempt to interact with it, that none of our click events are fired and the parent host component form control does not get a new value because it's disabled. Therefore, the user should not be able to interact with it in a way that would pass a new value. Key concepts for implementing the Control Value Accessor. Just keep in mind that it's really great for granular control of displaying something to the UI, but then communicating something else to the actual form control value. You want to keep your wrapper components very dumb. You just want to be inputting and outputting values. You want to leave the validation logic to the parent form component. And the CVA can be used with any form API, including form-driven. Feel free to take a picture of this. This is the slides available at that top link. If you want to play with the app in case you're trying to implement this on your own, go ahead and take a picture of that. And then if you like this sweet, sweet theme that I'm using here, that is Synth 84 that came out a couple days ago. So feel free to check that out. I hope you all walk away imbued with the power of the Control Value Accessor and ready to go out and solve all the form problems you could possibly run into. Thank you very much.